The Hayes farmhouse sat at the edge of Dawson County, where the land unfurled into miles of amber wheat, and the horizon wore a crown of dusk light every evening. From the porch, you could see everything and nothing at once: the ghost of the town's grain mill in the distance, the silhouette of cattle grazing against the sinking sun, and the faint shimmer of highway lights that promised a world larger than ours. That house had been in Ethan's family for 3 generations. Its walls carried more secrets than the people living inside them ever dared to speak. The floorboards creaked, like they were warning you to tread carefully, and the air, especially in summer, was thick with the scent of soil and old wood. When I married Ethan Hayes, people called it a humble match. I was 25 then, with a city degree and small-town dreams. Ethan had nothing but 2 calloused hands, a quiet mind, and the kind of eyes that saw beauty in the ordinary. He worked the land the way others recited, prayer slow, deliberate, faithful. But to his family, especially his sister-in-law Vanessa, that kind of honesty was a mark of smallness. Vanessa Turner was the kind of woman who spoke as if the air belonged to her. She had once been a cheerleader, later a real estate agent with a picture-perfect smile, and she carried her success like perfume. You could smell it before she entered a room. When she laughed, it was a performance. When she looked at Ethan, it was pity disguised as humor. That summer evening, I remember the first family dinner after Ethan and I moved into the farmhouse. The table was long, scarred with knife marks and candle wax drips from decades of meals and arguments. Diane, my mother-in-law, sat at the head, wearing her pearl earrings and a look of quiet command. Mark, my brother, and his wife Vanessa had driven in from the city, bringing wine none of us could pronounce. Ethan carved the roast while Vanessa poured herself a second glass and eyed the chipped plates. "You two really live out here full-time?" she asked, her tone light but her smile sharp. "Most of the time," I said, glancing at Ethan, who didn't look up. "It's peaceful." Vanessa laughed. "Peaceful? That's one word for it. I don't know how you do it. Clara living with dirt under your nails. You must have the patience of a saint." Mark joined in, chuckling. "Well, Ethan's a farmer at heart. Can't keep him away from the soil." Ethan only smiled, passing her the mashed potatoes. "It's honest work," he said. "Oh, I'm sure," Vanessa replied, the edge in her voice barely hidden. "But it's not exactly glamorous." The table fell silent for a moment, except for the ticking of the old wall clock and the hiss of corn boiling in the kitchen. Diane broke the quiet with a polite cough. "Vanessa's just teasing, dear. She means well." But the look in Vanessa's eyes told me she didn't. It was in moments like that, subtle, quiet, poisonous, that the tone of the family revealed itself. Diane favored appearances. She adored Mark, her firstborn, who worked at a bank and wore his success like armor. Ethan was her quiet disappointment, the one who never left the farm, never sought more than the horizon offered. I saw it in how she praised Mark's promotions and how she sighed when Ethan mentioned planting season. I tried to bridge the gap at first. I cooked, cleaned, helped with Sunday dinners. I smiled when Vanessa accidentally made comments about our clothes, our truck, the way Ethan's hands looked rough. But no amount of kindness could smooth the edges of her scorn. That night, after dinner, while the others moved to the porch for wine, I stayed behind to wash the dishes. The kitchen smelled of lemon soap and roast meat. The window over the sink framed the sunset streaks of gold and violet melting into the horizon. Ethan came in quietly, drying his hands on a towel. "She doesn't mean half of what she says," he told me gently. "She means enough," I replied, rinsing a plate. He smiled faintly. "You'll get used to it. Around here, folks judge worth by the shine of their boots." I looked at him then, his hands rough from labor, his jaw dusted with stubble, eyes still warm despite the mockery that lingered in the air. I thought about the contrast between his honesty and Vanessa's polish, and something inside me stirred pride, maybe, or defiance. Later, as the night deepened, I stood by the porch rail, listening to the cicadas and watching the stars appear one by one. Inside, laughter echoed Vanessa's sharp, Mark's hollow, Diane's polite. I felt like a ghost in my own family, seen but never truly welcomed. Vanessa stepped outside, her perfume cutting through the night air. She leaned against the post beside me, glass in hand. "You know," she said casually, "I used to think Ethan would marry someone from town, someone a little more ambitious." I turned to her, my hands tightening on the railing. "Ambition comes in different forms," I said. She smirked. "Of course it does. But you'll see, Clara, sometimes love isn't enough to keep you from sinking in the mud." She walked away before I could answer, her heels clicking on the wood, each step like punctuation to a sentence I hadn't finished reading. That night, after everyone left, I sat beside Ethan in the dim kitchen. The old refrigerator hummed like a tired song. He reached for my hand, his thumb brushing my palm. "I don't care what they say," he murmured. "This place, this life, it's ours." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think love was stronger than pride, that kindness could quiet cruelty. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the soft comfort of his words, a shadow lingered, a knowing that the world beyond our walls didn't see us as equals, that even within family, love could twist into something unkind. I remember blowing out the candle on the table, the flame shrinking into darkness. The smell of wax lingered as the house fell quiet. That was the first time I felt the faint ache of shame, not my own, but the kind handed to you by others until you start to carry it like it's yours. And as I sat there in the dim kitchen, holding Ethan's hand, I couldn't shake the thought that someday, love and dignity would be tested in ways neither of us could imagine. I should have known that night that in this family, love came with a price tag. Dreams, I've learned, don't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, they appear quietly between chores, between breaths, between the spaces where no one believes in you but yourself. For me, it began one muted spring morning. The rain had been falling for hours, tapping the tin roof like an impatient visitor. I was in the kitchen, mixing flour for bread, when the scent of vanilla and citrus from the soap I'd made 2 nights before caught me off guard. It filled the air warm, clean, real. Something about it made me pause. It was small, but it was mine. That day, I told Ethan I wanted to start something of my own. "A small shop," I said, "handmade candles and soaps, scents that remind people of home." He didn't laugh. He didn't call it silly or impossible. He just looked at me with those steady brown eyes, the kind that hold ground no matter how fierce the wind blows. "Then you should do it," he said. "You've got good hands for things that make people feel." We didn't have money, not really. But Ethan sold one of his old tractors, a red Massey Ferguson that had seen better years, and handed me the check like it was a blessing. "Seed money," he said, smiling faintly. "For you." I cried that night. Not because of the money, but because no one had ever believed in me like that before. The first candles were born on the kitchen counter, poured into jars that once held peaches and pickles. I spent hours perfecting the mixture of soy wax and fragrance oils, the ratio of lavender to bergamot, the right wick length. The house smelled like heaven, and even the cat seemed calmer when the candles burned. When I showed the first few to Vanessa at a family dinner, she lifted one delicately between her fingers and turned it as though inspecting a child's art project. "Oh, Clara," she said with that syrupy tone of hers. "These are adorable. A little country chic, aren't they?" Her husband, Mark, chuckled. "You're turning into a real pioneer woman now." Even Diane, my mother-in-law, smiled in that restrained, polite way she reserved for things beneath her concern. "It's a sweet idea, dear. Just don't let it distract you from helping Ethan with the farm." I smiled back and said nothing. But inside, I made a promise to myself and to Ethan that I would make something lasting out of this, something that no one could laugh away. The next months were a blur of exhaustion and small victories. I sold my first 10 candles at the farmer's market in Dawson. A woman with a kind smile said the scent reminded her of her mother's house, and I cried all the way home. I designed simple brown paper labels and stamped them by hand. "Hayes Home Goods, made with heart in Dawson County." Ethan built me shelves in the barn, and every night after supper he'd sit with me, reading the day's orders aloud while I wrapped jars in butcher paper. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like purpose. Then one afternoon Diane stopped by unannounced. She stood in the doorway of the barn, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt floor. "You're really taking this seriously," she said, scanning the rows of drying candles. "I am," I replied, setting down a tray. She smiled thinly. "Well, I suppose it's good to have a hobby, but you must understand, Clara, these little projects rarely last. I'd hate for you to waste Ethan's hard-earned money on experiments." The words stung, but I kept my voice even. "It's not wasted if it builds something." Diane folded her arms. "You have your head in the clouds, dear. Leave the business side to people who know what they're doing." It wasn't until later that I learned what she meant. At the next family gathering, Vanessa approached me in her immaculate blazer, her phone glinting in her hand. "You know," she said, "I could help you expand. Get your candles into boutiques. I have connections." I hesitated. "I'd need to be careful with expenses." She laughed. "Oh, sweet Clara, you just make the candles. Let the rest of us handle the numbers." Ethan was cautious but kind. "If they want to help, maybe it's not a bad idea," he said one night as we washed dishes. "It might bring more eyes to your work." So, reluctantly, I agreed to a family partnership. Vanessa would handle marketing, Diane would invest a little, and I'd keep creating. We shook hands over dinner and Diane said, "See? Family supporting family. That's what matters." I believed her. Weeks turned into months. Orders grew faster than I could pour. Vanessa handled sales calls, Mark helped with accounting, and Diane promised to back us if we hit a big opportunity. Then came that opportunity, a regional crafts expo in Street Louis. A booth there cost more than we could afford, but it could launch the business beyond Dawson. Diane assured me she'd cover the fee. When I asked for the check, she smiled gently. "Oh, dear, not yet. Let's wait until you've proven the model. You wouldn't want to take a risk before you're ready." It was the same week Vanessa stopped returning my calls. Ethan tried to soothe me, saying maybe they were busy, maybe they'd forgotten, but deep down, I knew. Their support had never been for me. It had been for what they could own, what they could name theirs. At the next family dinner, Vanessa raised her glass and said, "To Hayes Home Goods, Clara's little hobby gone professional. We're all so proud." Everyone clapped. Diane beamed. But I noticed how Vanessa spoke of we, not she, and when I glanced at Ethan, he looked away. That night, as I packed the car with leftover boxes and candles, Ethan wrapped his arms around me. "They'll come around," he whispered. I wanted to believe him. But as I stared into the darkness of the open barn door, I realized something had shifted. The warmth that once came from creating had cooled into something else, unease, maybe. I couldn't name it then, but I felt it like a draft sneaking under the door. The next morning, I found an envelope tucked under our mailbox. Inside was a printed invoice for supplies. I never ordered hundreds of dollars charged to the business account. Vanessa's name was on the supplier contact. When I called her, she brushed it off. "Oh, that? Just testing new packaging options. You'll thank me later." It was the first fracture in the foundation, small enough to ignore, but enough to echo in my chest. Still, I told myself to be patient. Family helped family. Maybe it was just miscommunication. But in the back of my mind, I could still hear Diane's voice, soft, polite, cutting. "Leave the business side to people who know what they're doing." And for the first time, I wondered if I'd handed my dream to the very people who might bury it. The first sign that things were turning came quietly, like a dawn you almost missed because you'd stopped believing morning would come. It was a Saturday in late September. The air carried that sweet mix of apples and smoke, and the fields outside our window glowed with the fading gold of harvest season. I was pouring wax into jars when Ethan walked in, holding a folded newspaper in his hand. His face was unreadable, the way it always was when he was holding something precious. "You might want to see this," he said, laying the Dawson Gazette on the counter. There it was on the community page, nestled between a church bake sale announcement and a high school football update. "Local maker brings the sense of the heartland home." Below it, a small photo, my candles, lined neatly on a wooden shelf, sunbeams catching the glass. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Ethan grinned, kissed my cheek, and said, "Told you people would see what I see." That night, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Orders from the next town over, then 2 counties away. I spent hours answering calls and writing addresses on brown packages. Vanessa called too, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "Clara, darling, I just saw the article. This is fantastic. I told everyone at the realtor's office that my sister-in-law is the candle queen of Dawson." I laughed, unsure if it was flattery or ownership. She went on about marketing strategies, brand positioning, and expanding our family enterprise. I let her talk. For the first time, I was too tired and too happy to hear the sharpness underneath. The following weeks were a blur of wax, ribbons, and late nights. Ethan built a new table in the barn to fit more molds. We filled the house with scents, cedarwood and sage, vanilla bean and musk, patchouli and orange peel. The whole property smelled like hope. At the next family gathering, things felt different. When we arrived at Diane's house, everyone was already talking about the Gazette article. "Oh, look at you," Diane said as soon as I stepped in, her pearls catching the light. "Our little entrepreneur. We're so proud." Even Vanessa seemed eager to play nice. "Clara, the shop in Jefferson wants to carry your candles. I might have mentioned you. We could really scale this thing up." Her words had softened since the last time, but there was a glint behind her eyes, a faint tension between praise and possession. Ethan, as always, kept to himself, sipping his sweet tea and talking to Mark about the harvest. Dinner that night felt almost civil. Laughter around the table, wine glasses clinking. For a brief moment, I thought maybe success could heal the quiet bruises of the past. Until Vanessa leaned forward and said, "So Clara, what's next? Are you planning to get a real storefront, or just keep doing the whole barnyard thing?" The word barnyard hung in the air, light as smoke but heavy as insult. Ethan's fork froze midair. Before I could answer, Diane spoke, smiling politely. Now, Vanessa, be nice. You know how creative types are, they like things rustic. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. I smiled through it, the way people do when they know the joke is at their expense. Later, as I helped Diane clear the dishes, she said, "You're doing well, dear. Just be careful. Too much success too fast can make people notice." I wanted to ask who people meant, but I already knew. By winter, Hayes Home Goods had become something real. I had distributors in 3 towns and an online shop managed from a second-hand laptop Ethan found for me. We were still living frugally, but there was lightness now, laughter in the mornings, purpose in every day. Ethan began talking about expanding the fields, growing lavender and rosemary ourselves instead of ordering them. "Make it a full circle," he said one night, sitting by the fire. "Farm to fragrance." I loved that. I loved him. But success doesn't only attract light, it casts shadows too. The first hint came when I noticed small discrepancies in the account statements, small amounts missing, transfers labeled as marketing expenses. Vanessa had access to the business card for promotional materials, so I asked her about it. "Oh, that," she said breezily over the phone. "Just some new labels and packaging tests. Don't worry, it's all under control." I wanted to believe her. After all, she'd helped open doors I couldn't. But something about her tone, that casual, dismissive lilt, unsettled me. Then came the boutique deal in Jefferson. The shop owner, a kind woman named Lynn, sent me an email thanking Vanessa Turner for arranging the exclusive product launch. My name wasn't even mentioned. When I brought it up, Vanessa brushed it aside. "It's all in the family, Clara. What's yours is ours. Don't get hung up on details." I tried to keep peace, but unease began to settle in my stomach like a stone. The night before Christmas Eve, Diane hosted her annual dinner, the kind where everything gleamed and every sentence carried subtext. Snow drifted softly against the windows, catching the glow of the chandelier. Vanessa arrived late, draped in a fur coat, her husband behind her carrying designer shopping bags. She hugged Diane first, then turned to me with that smooth, social smile. "I hear Jefferson sold out your candles in 2 days," she said. "That's wonderful, Clara. Though technically it's our candles, right?" Her voice was sugar over steel. I opened my mouth to answer, but Diane interrupted, clinking her glass. "To family success. We lift each other up together." Everyone raised their glasses. Everyone except Ethan. He stared into his drink, his jaw tight. Later, as we drove home through the falling snow, he said quietly, "Something's not right, Clara. They're taking more than they're giving." I looked out the window. The headlights cut through the white darkness, 2 fragile beams trying to find their way home. A few days later, while organizing invoices, I found a duplicate business registration form, filed under a different name, Turner and Hayes Home Co. Vanessa and Mark had listed themselves as primary owners. My own signature had been forged in shaky cursive at the bottom. I sat there for a long time, staring at it, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Outside, I could hear Ethan splitting wood, each strike of the axe echoing like a heartbeat through the cold air. When he came inside, his face glistened with sweat despite the chill. I held up the document without a word. He read it once, then again, slower. His jaw tightened. "They think you won't fight back," he said finally. I swallowed hard. "They think I don't know how." The fire in the stove popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Success doesn't destroy people. It reveals them. Something was being taken from me, silently. And soon, I'd see just how much. It happened in pieces, like a slow collapse, not a single blow. The kind of downfall that doesn't make noise until the floor's already gone beneath you. Winter lingered that year, sharp and unforgiving. The sky hung low over the farmhouse, heavy with unshed snow. I remember the way the cold crept through the window frames, the glass fogged from our breath as Ethan and I sat at the table, staring at numbers that didn't make sense. The business account had been emptied, over $17,000 gone. Every cent we'd saved, every order we'd fulfilled, vanished like smoke. I thought it was a bank error. I called, waited on hold for an hour, then another. The representative spoke kindly, but when she read the withdrawal authorization, my throat closed. "The signature on the form is yours, Mrs. Hayes," she said. I stared at the faxed copy. My name scrawled across the bottom in trembling ink. Only, it wasn't my handwriting. Not quite. Close enough to fool a banker, far enough to chill my blood. The date on the form was the same day Vanessa had dropped off the new marketing materials. She'd come smiling, her perfume filling the barn, her voice syrupy as she'd said, "Don't worry about the paperwork. I'll handle the boring stuff." I'd believed her. God help me, I'd believed her. The next week was a blur of phone calls, closed doors, and unanswered questions. Vanessa stopped replying entirely. Mark sent a brief text. "We'll talk soon, promise." Diane refused to get involved, insisting, "It's a misunderstanding. Don't ruin the family over paperwork." When I told her what the bank confirmed, she looked at me with that same cool detachment she'd always reserved for Ethan's hardships. "You should have read what you signed, Clara. It's not fair to blame others for your carelessness." Her words hit harder than the theft itself. Ethan didn't say much for a while. He worked through the days like a man possessed, mending fences, repairing tools, anything to keep from thinking. At night he'd sit on the porch, eyes fixed on the dark field as if waiting for something to crawl out of it. One evening, I stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee. He didn't turn when I sat beside him. "I should have protected you," he said finally. I touched his arm. "This isn't your fault." He shook his head. "They mocked me for being a farmer, said I didn't understand business. Maybe they were right. I should have seen what they were doing." The hurt in his voice hollowed me out. We sat there, both quiet, watching our breath rise like ghosts in the air. Days bled into weeks. Orders stopped because I couldn't fulfill them. My suppliers refused to send more materials without payment. Rumors began to ripple through Dawson, the kind that travel faster than truth. At the grocery store, 2 women whispered as I walked by, "Did you hear about the candle lady? Something about stolen money?" At the market, a former customer looked away when I waved. Vanessa and Mark had already spun their version of the story, that I'd mismanaged the funds, spent recklessly, then blamed them when things fell apart. They showed up one afternoon uninvited, unashamed. The gravel crunched under their tires as their SUV pulled up the drive. I was sitting on the porch steps when they climbed out, Vanessa in a cream coat, Mark with a smirk too small to hide. "Clara," she began, voice soft like honey hiding a thorn, "we thought we should come by before this gets any worse." "Worse?" I repeated, standing. My hands were trembling, though I tried to keep them still. Mark stepped forward, sighing. "Look, we all made mistakes. Maybe you got overwhelmed. Running a business isn't easy." I felt the air thin between us. "You forged my name. You emptied our account." Vanessa's eyes widened, feigned shock in every flutter. "Forged? Clara, you signed the forms." I was there. Ethan came to the door then, his face tight. "You lying snake," he said, his voice low but sharp. Vanessa turned to him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ethan, please, we're trying to help your wife save face. You can't really think this was our doing." Mark raised his hands, playing peacemaker. "Let's just calm down. No one's pressing charges, right? We can sort this privately." Ethan stepped down from the porch, closing the space between them. His shadow stretched long across the frozen ground. "Get off my land." Vanessa scoffed. "You can't be serious." "I said leave," he growled. "Before I forget your family." They left. But not before Vanessa leaned close to me, her perfume sickly sweet. "Be careful, Clara," she whispered. "People are watching how you handle this. Don't embarrass yourself." When the car disappeared down the dirt road, I realized my legs were shaking so hard I could barely stand. That night we sat in silence by the wood stove. The light flickered across the walls, and I stared at the flames until they blurred. Ethan finally said, "We could go to the sheriff." "They'll say it's a civil matter," I murmured. "It's our word against theirs. No one in this town will side with us." He clenched his jaw. "Then we start over." But we couldn't, not yet. The debt collectors came first. Then the landlord for the small downtown space we'd been renting for stock. We sold the last of our supplies for half their worth. Ethan tried to hide the foreclosure notice from me, but I found it in the drawer. By spring, the business was gone. The humiliation was worse than the loss. At the next town fair, I watched as Vanessa set up a booth, her own line of Turner home candles. My designs, my scents, my words on the labels, slightly altered but recognizable. She smiled for photos with the mayor's wife while I stood across the street, invisible. Someone asked her how she'd gotten started. She laughed and said, "It all began with a little idea from the family. We've worked so hard for this." I walked away before I could throw up. One night, months later, Ethan and I had dinner in near silence. The sound of the fork scraping the plate was louder than either of us could bear. Finally, he spoke. "You still want to fight them?" I didn't answer right away. I stared at my hands, dry, cracked, stained with wax that no longer had purpose. Then I nodded. Not like before, not with anger, but yes. He reached across the table, his fingers wrapping around mine. "Then we'll find a way." We didn't speak again that night. The house creaked, the wind howled through the fields, and I felt something inside me break, not in rage, but in clarity. A week later, I packed away the last of the unsold candles into a wooden crate. Before closing the lid, I lit one, the lavender and cedar blend Ethan loved most. The scent filled the kitchen, soft and familiar. It made the emptiness almost bearable. As the wax melted, I realized the flame didn't fight the darkness, it simply made space within it. And somewhere inside that small, flickering circle of light, I understood that this wasn't the end. It was the silence before the storm. The farmhouse felt different after the betrayal. It wasn't just the loss of money or reputation, it was as though the walls themselves had absorbed our sorrow. The air inside was heavy, and silence hung like fog. Every sound, footsteps, the wind against the window panes, the occasional groan of wood settling echoed through the emptiness. Ethan had started taking extra shifts at the grain mill to keep us afloat. He came home late, his clothes dusted with wheat, the scent of machinery clinging to him. His hands were cracked from the cold and labor, but he never complained. I tried to find small jobs, cleaning houses, bookkeeping. Anything but nothing filled the hole left by the business we'd built. The days blurred together. I stopped lighting candles, as if their glow mocked the light that had gone out inside me. Our home, once filled with soft music and laughter, became a place of muted breathing and unfinished sentences. Sometimes I'd walk the fields at dusk, the frost crunching beneath my boots, and look out at the horizon where the sun bled into gray. The barn, where I used to pour wax and dream of new scents, now stood hollow. Dust coated the shelves. The faint smell of lavender still lingered, but it felt like a ghost, something too gentle to survive what had happened. Spring came slow that year. The earth thawed reluctantly, the creek behind our house swollen with meltwater. Ethan's quietness deepened. He carried the kind of exhaustion that no sleep could touch. One night I found him sitting by the wood stove, staring at a photograph our wedding day. His thumb brushed across the glass where my face smiled back, radiant and full of faith in the future. "Do you ever wish we'd done things differently?" he asked without looking up. His voice was low, almost afraid of its own question. I hesitated. Sometimes, but if we hadn't tried, we'd still be wondering what could have been. He nodded, but his shoulders slumped as if the answer didn't ease him. "They took more than money, Clara. They took what I believed in." I sat beside him, watching the firelight dance in his tired eyes. "Then we'll build something they can't touch." He gave a small, broken laugh. "Like what?" I didn't know yet. But somewhere deep inside me, a small ember still burned, faint, but alive. The breaking point came that summer. We received an eviction notice for the small downtown space we'd been renting, even though it had sat empty for months. A forgotten contract clause, something Vanessa must have slipped in, held us liable for another 6 months' rent. The debt was more than we could pay. Ethan didn't come home that night. When I found him at dawn, he was sitting in the truck, parked by the old bridge outside town. His face was gray with fatigue, his hands gripping the wheel as if afraid to let go. "I thought about driving," he said quietly. "Just driving until the road ran out." I reached for his hand. "And then?" He stared at the horizon. "I don't know." The wind outside howled through the trees, bending them low, and I realized that we were both on the edge of breaking. Life had stripped us down to bone. But maybe that was what it took to see what was left when everything else was gone. In the following weeks, I stopped trying to save what couldn't be saved. I sold the remaining stock, cleared the barn, and gave away the rest. One evening, as I stacked the last boxes, I found my old notebook, the one I'd used to plan every cent, every name. Its pages were smudged, some stained with wax. Between 2 sheets, I found a handwritten list of quotes I'd once collected about resilience, about finding meaning in hardship. One line stood out. "The phoenix must burn to emerge." I sat there in the half-light of the barn, tears running silently down my face. For the first time, I wasn't mourning the loss. I was mourning the version of myself that believed she needed permission to shine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and caught my reflection in the window. The woman staring back was thinner, older, eyes darker from too many sleepless nights. But there was something else in her gaze, something harder, steadier. I whispered to her, "You're still here." And that was enough. I began to rebuild not the business, not yet, but myself. I woke earlier, walked farther, started journaling again. I learned to listen to silence, to sit with pain without letting it consume me. Ethan noticed the change before I did. "You've got that look again," he said one morning, half smiling. "What look?" "The one you had when you first started making candles." I laughed softly. "Maybe I just remembered who I am." He reached out and brushed his thumb across my cheek. Then the rest will come. A week later, I got a call from an old customer, Mrs. Warren, a retired teacher who'd bought candles from me since the beginning. She'd opened a small cafe by the lake and wanted to stock locally made goods. "If you ever start again," she said, "I'll be your first order." After I hung up, I sat in silence, heart pounding. The words echoed in my mind, "Start again." That night, I told Ethan. He didn't hesitate. "Then we start again," he said simply. I smiled, though fear prickled beneath the hope. "We have nothing left." He took my hand. "That means we have nothing to lose." The first step was small. I began crafting again just a few candles, using leftover supplies. I renamed them Emberlight. The first one I made smelled of smoke and sandalwood, with a hint of vanilla. It reminded me of survival of something that refused to die even when the world grew cold. I sold 5 candles in the first week, 10 the next. People began asking for more. They weren't buying wax, they were buying the story of endurance, of second chances. The flame that had once been stolen from me began to glow again, steady and deliberate. Every night, before bed, I lit one candle and watched it burn. The wax would melt, shimmer, then harden again, changing form, but never losing essence. It reminded me that maybe we weren't ruined, just reshaped. And somewhere deep in the heart of that quiet rebirth, I felt something else stirring, a vision, a plan forming slowly like dawn breaking through long darkness. Vanessa and Mark had taken everything they could from me, but they hadn't taken me. And that realization was the beginning of everything that came next. Revenge never arrived as rage, it came as clarity. A calm, deliberate awakening. I didn't wake one morning wanting to destroy Vanessa and Mark. I woke wanting to build something they could never steal. It began quietly, like the first green after a long frost. Orders for Emberlight trickled in, then doubled, then tripled. Word spread first through the cafe, then through social media. My candles carried not just scent but story, each one named after a season of endurance: Ashfall, Solace, Renewal, Phoenix. By autumn, Emberlight had become more than a brand. It was a symbol. Customers sent letters, sharing how the scent of Solace helped them through grief, how Renewal became the smell of their new beginnings. Every message rekindled something in me. Ethan built shelves in the barn again, repaired the old workbench, rewired the lights. The barn that once echoed with defeat now glowed with quiet purpose. At night, the golden flicker of candles shimmered through the windows, casting warmth onto the cold fields outside. We weren't rich, not yet, but we were steady. And I'd learned something invaluable. Success that grows from suffering has roots too deep to be torn out. One crisp October morning, I received an invitation that stopped my breath. The Dawson County Women's Entrepreneurship Gala, an event Vanessa had attended every year, flashing her perfect smile and designer dress, standing beside the very people who had once turned their backs on me. This year, the committee chair, a woman named Grace Whitmore, who'd once bought a candle from the cafe, had written, "We've been deeply inspired by your work with Emberlight. We would love to feature you as a keynote speaker and nominee for Businesswoman of the Year." I read it twice, then again, the words blurring as my heart thudded. Ethan looked up from the kitchen table. "You're going?" "I'm going," I said, my voice steady. In the weeks leading up to the gala, something sharper began to crystallize beneath my calm. Revenge wasn't about shouting. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about truth unfolding at the exact moment they could no longer deny it. I hired a small local marketing firm, discreet, skilled, and loyal. We designed new packaging, refined branding, built an online store. I partnered with Mrs. Warren's Cafe to launch a Light from the Heartland initiative, donating proceeds to rural women starting small businesses. The story gained traction. Within 2 months, Emberlight was featured in a lifestyle magazine. The article highlighted how a small-town woman rebuilt her dream after betrayal. The writer asked if I wanted to name names. I declined. I didn't need to. Everyone in Dawson knew the story, even those who pretended not to. The night of the gala arrived cold and glittering. The hotel ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, the air heavy with perfume and pride. I wore a simple navy dress, my hair swept back. Ethan stood beside me in his best jacket, clean, pressed, a quiet confidence about him. When we entered, heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. I saw familiar faces, people who had once crossed the street to avoid me, now smiling too quickly. And there they were. Vanessa and Mark, standing near the champagne bar, dressed to impress. Her smile froze when she saw us. Mark's eyes darted away, his jaw tightening. For a moment, I felt the old sting, the humiliation, the anger, but it passed like smoke. Grace, the event chair, greeted me warmly. Clara, we're so glad you're here. Everyone's talking about Emberlight. Vanessa's head turned sharply at the name. Grace didn't notice. As we mingled, Vanessa approached, her tone falsely bright. Clara, I didn't know you'd be here. I smiled. I was invited. Her eyes narrowed. Still making candles, are you? Yes, I said evenly. Still using my hands. Some of us prefer real work. She forced a laugh. Well, it's wonderful to see you. You look different. I feel different, I replied. Stronger. Her smirk faltered. Dinner was served white linen, soft jazz, wine poured into crystal. Across the room, I caught snippets of conversation. People praising Emberlight, the article, the initiative. Vanessa's name came up too, but not kindly. Rumors had begun to circulate about Turner Home Candles' delayed orders, unpaid suppliers, cheap materials imported under false claims of being handmade. The tables had begun to turn long before I arrived. After dinner, Grace took the stage. This year, she announced, we celebrate women who rise from adversity, who turn struggle into purpose. My name followed. The applause was warm, real. Ethan squeezed my hand as I walked to the stage. My heels clicked against the marble floor like punctuation marks to a sentence I'd been waiting years to finish. Under the lights, I took a breath. The room quieted. I started Emberlight in a barn, I began. After losing everything, money, trust, reputation, what I thought was my dream burned down to ash. But what I learned is that sometimes ashes are fertile ground. A murmur ran through the crowd. Vanessa's face was pale, rigid. I learned that the hands that build are stronger than the mouths that mock, and that true success isn't loud, it's steady, honest, and born from the heart. Applause rose, filling the room like thunder. I caught Ethan's eyes, proud, teary, unwavering. When I stepped down, Grace handed me the award, a glass flame on a wooden base, engraved with my name. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Later, as guests mingled, Vanessa approached again, her mask slipping. You set this up, she hissed under her breath. You made me look like a fool. I met her gaze calmly. No, Vanessa, you did that yourself. You think you've won? I didn't come here to win, I said softly. I came here to light what you tried to extinguish. She opened her mouth, but Mark tugged at her arm, whispering something sharp. Their argument carried just enough for nearby guests to notice. By the end of the night, whispers trailed them like shadows. The next few weeks unfolded like slow, poetic justice. Suppliers began cutting ties with Turner Home Candles. Customers complained online about defective products. Vanessa's reputation unraveled one thread at a time. Then came the final turn. An investigative article surfaced written by the same journalist who'd covered my comeback. She discovered that Turner Home Candles had been using my early formulas and designs without proper licensing. Screenshots of old emails and photographs of stolen prototypes appeared in the report. The evidence was undeniable. The company folded within a month. When I read the news, I didn't cheer. I simply exhaled. Ethan found me on the porch, the article glowing on my phone screen. It's over, he said. No, I murmured, watching the sunset stretch gold across the fields. It's just balanced. Weeks later, we reopened our barn not as a workshop, but as a small studio store. Customers came from miles away to see where Emberlight was born. The shelves gleamed with soft glass jars, each one burning with a steady, confident glow. A woman asked if the story behind the brand was true. Yes, I said, every word. And as she smiled, I thought of the night Vanessa called my husband a farmer with disdain, and how that same farmer now stood by the door greeting guests, humble and unbent, the very image of strength she could never understand. I didn't destroy them with vengeance. I destroyed them with endurance. And that, I realized, was the truest revenge of all. The air smelled different that spring. Softer, cleaner, the kind of scent that only comes after a storm has spent its fury. Our land had bloomed again, wildflowers spilling over the edges of the fence line, apple blossoms opening pale and sweet in the orchard. The fields shimmered gold at sunrise, and the barn, once a place of grief, now glowed each night with the steady warmth of candles burning inside. Emberlight had become more than a business. It had become a movement. Women from neighboring towns visited for workshops, learning how to pour, scent, and sell their own creations. Some came carrying the same kind of heartbreak I once knew: betrayal, loss, humiliation. Others simply came for light. I never asked for their stories, but they told them anyway, and each time, as I listened, I felt something in me heal just a little more. Ethan built a long wooden table in the center of the barn for those workshops. He carved it by hand, the way his father once built furniture, patiently, without hurry. When I ran my fingers over the grain, I could feel the history there. Sweat, effort, quiet pride. People used to mock him for being just a farmer. Now, the same hands that once tilled soil had built the foundation of an empire born from truth and resilience. A year passed before I saw Vanessa again. It was a gray afternoon in late March. I had driven into town to meet with the local bank this time to discuss a loan for expanding production. As I stepped out of the truck, I noticed her sitting on the bench across from the courthouse, shoulders hunched, hair tied back with careless haste. She didn't see me at first. Her coat was frayed, and the gloss of her old life had faded. Mark was nowhere in sight. Rumor had it that after their company collapsed, he'd left her and filed for bankruptcy. She was living in a small rental near the edge of town. I almost walked past, but something made me stop. When she finally looked up, our eyes met. For a moment, time folded in on itself. I saw the woman who once smirked across my dinner table, her laughter sharp as glass. But what looked back at me now wasn't arrogance, it was recognition. "Clara," she said softly. Her voice carried none of the confidence it once had. I nodded. "Vanessa." She hesitated, searching for something to say, then settled on, "You did well." I didn't smile. "I survived." She swallowed, her gaze flickering. "I didn't mean for it to go so far." "Yes, you did," I said gently. "You just didn't think you'd get caught." She winced, but there was no anger left in her only defeat. After a moment she said, "I lost everything." I looked at her, not with vengeance, but with an understanding I didn't expect. Sometimes you have to lose everything to learn what matters. Her eyes filled, but she said nothing more. I turned to go. Then, as I reached my truck, I heard her voice again, quiet, almost breaking. "Do you ever forgive?" I paused. The question hung in the cold air between us. "I did," I said, "but not for you." And then I drove away. The expansion came later that summer, a second barn converted into a larger workspace, new employees hired from the community, including single mothers, veterans, and 2 teenage girls who reminded me of myself at that age, uncertain, but full of possibility. We launched a new line called Resurge. Each candle carried a word etched into the glass. Faith, strength, stillness, rise. At the launch event, the mayor spoke, photographers snapped pictures, and the local news aired a segment titled, "From Betrayal to Brilliance." When the camera turned to me, I smiled, not the practiced kind, but one that came from quiet satisfaction. "This isn't about revenge," I said into the microphone. "It's about rebuilding from the inside out. It's about showing that light doesn't ask permission to shine." The audience applauded, and when the lights dimmed, hundreds of candles flickered to life, their glow dancing across faces and walls. Ethan stood near the back, arms folded, pride radiating from him in the way, only a man who has weathered every storm beside you can. He was still my farmer, calloused hands, soft eyes, steady heart. But to me, that word no longer carried any insult. It meant foundation. It meant truth. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale. Some nights were still hard. Some dreams still carried the scent of loss. But I had learned that joy doesn't need perfection, it needs presence. I found peace in the simplest moments. Morning coffee steaming beside the window, the hum of cicadas in summer, Ethan's laughter when the dog chased fireflies across the yard. Every so often, I'd find one of my old candles, the ones I made before everything fell apart. I never relit them. I kept them as reminders of who I was before I learned how strong I could be. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the fields into molten gold, I walked out to the porch. Ethan was already there, his boots resting on the step, a half-finished cup of coffee beside him. He looked up at me and smiled. "You've done it," he said simply. I leaned against the railing. "We've done it." The horizon stretched wide before us, endless and forgiving. After a long silence, I said, "Do you remember when Vanessa called you a farmer like it was something shameful?" He chuckled, low and warm. "I do." I turned to him. "Funny thing is, everything we have came from that soil she thought was beneath us." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The earth gives back to those who stay." And as the last light of day slipped behind the trees, I realized how far we'd come. There was no grand finale, no triumphant parade, just 2 people sitting on their porch, surrounded by fields that had once held their pain and now held their peace. The world had seen my revenge as a victory story, but to me, it was something quieter, something purer. The sweetest revenge wasn't in their ruin. It was in the life I built without them. It was in the light that kept burning steady, unashamed, and mine. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Your support means the world, and it helps me bring more stories like this to life.